You're listening to the Good Food CFO podcast, where we focus on financial strategies for building a profitable food business. I'm your host, Sarah Delavan. Today on the podcast, I am joined by Ashley Sutterfield, CEO of Metzger Roth, a boutique consulting firm helping packaged food entrepreneurs prepare for commercializing their product with a co-packer. Ashley is walking us through the process from finding your co-packer to formulation to initial product run, and she's detailing the costs all along the way. Getting clear on the cost of working with a co-packer and how much money you'll need to finance both your first and your ongoing production runs is important to the financial success of your business. So grab a pen and paper and let's get to it. Ashley, thank you so much for joining me here today on the podcast. I'm so excited to chat with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sarah. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Before we dive into, learning about and talking about co-packers today, which is, where we're going to focus, I want to touch a little bit on your background because similar to myself, you've got a little bit of a unique history and a unique, I think, career in the food industry. So can you tell us how you landed or found your way into the role that you have today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I began my career as a butcher and a food scientist and began developing products for large corporate companies on the meat side of the business and did commercialization work for chain restaurants like Domino's Pizza and Panda Express. And in doing that is where I spent the majority of my time in co-packers and manufacturing facilities, learning about the processes and how to take a product gold standard and reverse engineer it with a co-packer. And through that work, found that I loved it, but I also had a passion for food entrepreneurs. And so in 2018, I launched Metzger Roth, and we are a boutique consulting firm just working with food entrepreneurs to really hone in on partnering with a co-packer.
I think that your background, I love it. I don't know many people who have that sort of like butcher, background and specialty. I just love it so much. And not only that, when we connected, I was so happy to meet someone who really specialized in the area of co-packers and finding a co-packer and working with co-packers, because I think to many food business owners or beverage business owners who are just starting out, right? There's so much that you don't know about the industry as a whole. And co-packers is for sure one of those areas. And for those listening, maybe we should get clear on what are we talking about when we say the term co-packer? Can you clarify or define that for our listeners today?
Yeah, there's a lot of confusion a lot of times around, is the co-packer the same as a co-man? And is a co-man the same thing as a manufacturer? And what do these terms mean? And they are the same. So just to clarify that up front, you will find people in industry that will refer to themselves as a co-packer. You'll find some that say we're a co-man or a co-manufacturer. That is all the same lingo, just different terminology. So, and that really a co-packer is someone who helps you scale your product and commercialize it for the growth of your business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I work primarily with business owners whose businesses are like 0 to 5 years old, right? Mm-hmm. And I know many of our listeners fall into that category as well. And many have been manufacturing or producing their products on their own for a long time. And when they think about scaling, they think, okay, we're going to hit a point where we're going to move to a co-packer. There are also some business owners who have a great idea for a product. Maybe they've got a recipe that's really great and they have no interest in manufacturing or producing that product on their own. And I'm curious, is there a right time or a right stage in the business for someone to start thinking about working with a co-packer or finding a co-packing partner?
I'm so glad you asked this question because it's a common dilemma for companies, especially if they're brand new, to think about, I don't have the time to produce this product, but I want to launch this brand. And I will just say there's a co-packer for everyone. There may just be one co-packer for everyone. You may not have options, but there's a co-packer for everyone. And so if you're a company, I recommend getting clear on your values. Is do you have the income or the budget to be able to spend with a co-packer, to hire a co-packer? And are you limited on time and can't do the production yourself or don't want to do the production yourself? If you're a brand new company and in that spot, then consider a co-packer. There are co-packers who may operate out of a kitchen and do more hand blending of products, just as you would do if you were running the product yourself, but that's an option. And if you're a company who has been in business for 3 years and you're just at a point where you can't produce your product yourself anymore, you've outgrown your capacity, then it's time to look for a co-packer.
Yeah. That's so great. I think, some folks that I've talked to said, well, I can't, partner with the co-packer until I've been on the market for a certain amount of time. So I love that there's really a thought process that you lay out to kind of think about it. It's like, where are you at? And do you have the budget? And where do you want to be focusing your time, right? If you have got a small team and perhaps you want to be focused on selling the product, perhaps that's another situation, right? Where having a co-packer to do the manufacturing for you makes sense. And then you can focus on the other parts of the business.
Absolutely. Because if you're focused on sales, then you could be growing your business, 20% in the next quarter versus being constrained by the time that you're dedicating to production then. So it's definitely a consideration to take with where you need to be spending your time in your business.
Yeah. And when business owners are ready to start reaching out to co-packers or they're thinking about, taking that step, a conversation that I have with them, if we're working one-on-one or they're part of one of, the online program is, okay, have you thought about the costs associated with that, right? And you mentioned if you have the budget for a co-packer and I raise the question to those business owners, what is the budget, right? Do you have an idea of what that spend might look like, not only to have them produce the product for you, right? Because that's one thing, but just to get through that sort of onboarding process. And that's what you and I are going to dive into today. And I'm so excited for you to lay this out for people. So let's start at the beginning. Let's say we're going to create a scenario here and we'll work through the scenario if that's cool with you. So let's say we've got a dressing, very unique dressing that we have created and we want to work with a co-packer, but the dressing is just, it's my recipe and I have it written down. Can I just hand that recipe to the co-packer and say, make this for me?
You can. They're going to be a little cantankerous with you. And I will say this is probably 95% of what they get from companies is just a recipe. So they're used to it, but it's also not the best way to approach a relationship because you're wanting to create a long-term partnership with this co-packer. And so I see companies a lot of times they may jump into a co-packer relationship just to find themselves in a bad relationship and move on 6 months later. And the financial impact of that is so significant. So really what we're trying to do is back up to the very beginning. And if companies can spend the time to develop a formulation before going to a co-packer, then that's going to just create a solid foundation with the co-packer for that relationship to flourish.
Can I ask a super basic question? Mm-hmm. What's the difference between my recipe and a formulation?
Good question, because this is a lot of times it's just such a common mistake that, and if you're not aware, you're just not aware. There's not a lot of places to find this information. So a recipe is something that you have measurements of cups and tablespoons and teaspoons, home measurements that you're doing. Mm-hmm. A formulation is grams, weights, pounds, and percentages. And what that allows the product to do is to be commercialized. So if you're producing a 5-pound batch, but you have 50% oil in your dressing, then you know, at least relatively, that as you get to 1,000-pound batch, you're going to have still 50% of oil in that product.
Right.
Versus if you were in cups and tablespoons, it's going to be a disaster and require a lot more time to commercialize.
Got it. And so what does the process of developing that formulation look like, or converting that recipe to a formulation? How can we go about that? Is it something that business owners usually do on their own, or is it something that you can or should get help with?
Typically, I see companies feeling like they need to hire someone to do this, but I want to say that's absolutely not necessary. It is possible to create a formulation yourself, and we have a program in place that teaches companies how to create their own formulas so that they're empowered. But there's other resources online too. But really, there's several options for how to create a formula. You can hire a consulting service, and typically that's a food scientist who's going to convert your recipe to a formulation. And you can find that in two different ways that they're going to charge you. One is hourly. Typically that average is about $100 to $200 an hour. And the other is project-based. And again, this can vary widely depending upon what you're asking that company to do. But the price range is typically between $2,000 and $20,000.
Wow.
$20,000, I would walk away from that, honestly. It's not worth it. It's absolutely not necessary to spend that much, but I have seen that range. And so I just want to make companies aware of that. If you see something on that upper range, it's typically going to be a full service type of consulting company that they're actually going to the co-packer and down the road, and they're helping produce your product. They're helping with evaluations, and it's really hands-off for you. So for most entrepreneurs, though, that's not where we want to be. Most food entrepreneurs, as you know, hold their product very close to their heart, and we want to be involved in the process. And so that project-based in the $2,000 to $5,000 is typically a good range. And as far as the two options between hourly and project-based, there's nothing wrong with either one, but I would recommend for companies to have a project-based budget, because you're able to budget for that, right? If you know it's going to cost you $5,000, before you start work with the company, you can budget for it. If you're on an hourly basis, you're not billed till after the fact. So it's very hard to know how many hours are actually going to be spent. And so you could still be paying $5,000, but you've thought of it in $100 to $200 increments and not as prepared for that bill as if you were doing a project-based
I love that
service.
Tip. I like that.
And then the other options, one is a free or reduced cost option for your formulation, is actually to work with a university. If you have a state university that is funded by state, they often have a food science department or a food and ag products center. And a lot of times they'll offer either a free service for in-state residents, or it'll be extremely reduced where it's a couple $100. This is an excellent option, and I really encourage companies to try to partner with universities. They have so many incredible resources that are free or, again, reduced costs that are going to save companies a lot of money and be able to help them through that process too.
Love that. That's amazing. And then, as you mentioned too, you can do it on your own. And you mentioned for that, it's like you have a tool or a program to help people through that. So amazing.
Yeah. So we have a tool, but we've written online resources for companies to help explain how to do this. So if someone wants more of a one-on-one approach with a coach to help them walk through the process, we can certainly do that. But then we do explain it in blog posts and different areas for you to be able to do your own formulation, because it's really about just taking the time to weigh your ingredients as you're doing your production and doing that enough times that you have some replications. And then converting those weights into percentages. 100% formula is what it's called. And so it's a simple method. It can seem very daunting, though, whenever you aren't aware of what that should look like. And really, I want to say to companies, it's just a step-by-step process. And it's very simple, very straightforward, and completely doable.
Love it. Thank you. And so once you've got your formulation nailed down, you've got the percentages all figured out, what is the next step in the process?
Yeah, so the next step would be to begin conversations with a co-packer.
Okay.
And as you're doing that, of course, there's a lot of resources online, and that's a podcast for another time. But the next step in the process is to really hone in on which co-packers do you want to continue conversations with. And when I say co-packers, typically at this phase, I would be recommending for a company to have 2, maybe 3 co-packers that they're talking to. And once they've made it through co-packer interviews and you've really narrowed down to the one co-packer that you want to begin testing with, you're okay with their pricing at this point. So that's important as well. And if you don't have a formula in place before going to the co-packer, you're going to have this kitchen testing step before they can ever even give you a price. So one of the benefits of having your formulation complete before talking to a co-packer is that you can get pricing much more effectively and efficiently up front rather than having to wait on a kitchen test to be done and developing that formula with you.
Okay. And when you talk about what you said, if you're okay with their price, the things that make up that price are the things we're going to talk about in the next steps. Is that right? Like the feasibility testing and some other things, or are there other prices to consider?
No. So the price I'm actually referring to is the producing price. So what is the cost per unit price? And you can, that's obviously very important on the front end. So that if you're not comfortable with that pricing and they're $1 over the cost of goods you had planned for, then they're not the right co-packer and you need to start again. Okay. So it's good to at least have that pricing conversation and understand if you're comfortable with what they're able to do for you.
Yeah. And that price, correct me if I'm wrong, is going to be based on obviously the product that you're producing, how much of the materials and ingredients they're providing, and then the volume of product that you're producing. Is there anything else that gets considered in that pricing?
Yeah, of course there's labor cost. We have to remember that a co-packer is also operating a business. And so they're going to have labor cost. They have a margin built in as well. Again, you said packaging and ingredients. Those are all part of it, but it really comes down to just your cost of goods for every single piece that the co-packer would need to run their business, just as you need to run your business.
Great. And so once we've determined that, okay, this co-packer meets criteria and things we're going to save for another podcast episode, and they can meet the, per unit price or cost, let's say, that we need to hit in our business, then we say, okay, this is our short list that we're continuing the conversation with. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then where do we go from there?
So the next step is production testing. And this is the part where a lot of times a co-packer will have a fee for this service.
Okay.
And this fee is, it has several purposes. Oftentimes it's included to understand if your product is feasible for their process and for the ingredients they can source. So it gives them an idea of whether they want to continue the relationship or whether they can based on what they can source or produce. And it also gives the insight into, it gives you skin in the game so that you're not just using them as a resource and moving on. That makes the co-packer very sour, which is understandable. because they do invest a lot of time into this. And so that is often why I see co-packers, just to give their perspective of why they have a fee for this. Those are the reasons. They typically, per product, cost will range anywhere from $500 to $3,000 per product.
Okay.
And a lot of times, though, that will include up to 3 tests per formula.
Okay.
So what that means is that on average, it takes a co-packer about 3 production tests in order to get to a final product that a company is happy with. Of course, you can go way over that and way under that, but 3 is typically the average. So most co-packers factor that in to their cost and say, we will give you 3 production tests at this rate per product.
So if you have 3, in the salad dressing case, if you've got 3 flavors, let's say, that's 3 different formulas. And so it would be, there's a cost for up to, let's say, 3 tests for each of those formulas.
Yes. Now, one thing to note, though, is that if, say, someone has something like a salsa and they have a base tomato jalapeno formula, but then they may add in, say, a habanero pepper for one formulation, and they may just have these different flavor profiles of the same foundational formula.
Yeah.
It's worth asking if you can have just a single rate for one formulation instead of paying, say, for 4 formulas, if you have 4 different flavor profiles, to see if they'll just charge you for one, because it's really about developing that foundation and then making some tweaks for the other ingredients and the other flavor profiles. Yeah. And sometimes that works. Co-packers sometimes will say, oh yeah, that makes sense, because it's not requiring all of our time to develop 4 completely different products.
Right.
And instead, yeah, we understand that we're developing one product and making some adjustments in the formula for the other flavors. So yeah, we'll consider just doing a 1 formulation cost.
That's awesome to know. And so I love that you've pointed out that this is an important step, both for the co-packer and for the business owner, to make sure this is sort of a compatibility check, right? So like you said, some skin in the game for the business owner, but also I imagine this is a part where you can taste your product at the end and make sure that the result is what you want or need it to be, what your expectation is.
Yes, absolutely. And also to keep in mind with that you're responsible for the product at the end of that production test. So if you want to, there's different ways to sell through it. If it is acceptable, use it as inventory.
Yeah.
If you don't need a process authority letter, I will just say that.
Okay.
But if you aren't happy with the product, see if you can sell it at a discounted rate to your online consumer, or offer a deal for a store to purchase it. There's different ways to sell through the product, but just keep in mind that it is yours at the end of the production test.
And I want to ask one clarifying question. So we talked about the $500 to $3,000 per formula. Because they are actually producing a finished product, are you also paying the per unit cost on top of that? Or is this test sort of all encompassing and that covers like a small amount of units?
Yeah, typically this encompasses the test itself. Okay. So the finished product from that test, because you're going to have to use ingredients and do a production run. And so this is really to mitigate the cost for the co-packer in purchasing the ingredients and the packaging. And I will say some co-packers a lot of times will, if you have any special ingredients, they'll bill you that at cost outside of the production test fee. And that's pretty common, and it makes sense because it's probably not something they're ordering 50 gallons of horseradish for this
Right.
test, and they don't use that on a daily basis. So it doesn't make sense for them to pay for that if they're never going to use it. So
Yeah.
just keep that in mind, that there may be a few additional costs, but for the most part, it does, that fee includes the finished product.
Okay. And then once we've gone through this test and, obviously, we hope to find the co-packer that, it works out. And so we want to move forward. Is it as easy as saying, yes, let's do this? And
Yeah, it's a pretty straightforward process. Co-packers want to move forward with you typically as much as you want to move forward with them.
yeah.
It does require getting on their schedule.
Okay.
So they may require a 4 or 6 week lead time the first production run, and then after that it may be just 2 weeks. But it does require a bit of time typically to get on their calendar. And they're willing to move forward with you. I do encourage companies to have a signed contract in place, though. Whether that's just a monthly trial contract or a 6-month contract or a year, whatever that looks like, I do recommend that you have the stipulations of your relationship lined out before moving forward with a full production run.
That's a great recommendation. So to this point, we have made a potential investment into getting our formula created, taking our recipe and turning it into a formula. We've gotten our feasibility test done, and we've invested somewhere between $500 and $3,000 per formula to test the product and make sure that both the co-packer and we, the business owner, are happy. You mentioned something called a process authority letter. I have no idea what that is, and it's possible that some folks listening might not either. So can you tell us what that is and if there's a cost associated with that we should be considering for our budget here?
Yeah, absolutely. So a process authority letter is really just authorizing the process at that co-packer for the product that you're developing. And it's not required for every product. It's acidified foods is where it's most common. So
Okay.
if you do have a salsa or a tomato sauce, anything in that realm, you would need to have a process authority letter. And what that does is a lot of times the co-packer will actually handle the submission of the paperwork. And what that they will do is prepare what their process is and the ingredients that they're using. So they'll take your formulation and their processing procedures and submit that to what is called a process authority. And there's typically a few people in a state that are authorized to do this. A lot of times they're employed by a university in extension or in the food product center. It's typically a food scientist or a food microbiologist that is a process authority. And they're just validating that what the process and formulation for your product is at this co-packer, that is valid for consumer safety.
Got it.
And typically the cost with that is around $600. That can vary by state, but I don't see it very often. It's really pretty straightforward, but it does have a timeline associated with it. So I always tell companies, keep in mind that a process authority letter typically takes 6 to 8 weeks to get. And until you have that, you don't have a sellable product. So if you did the production test, but didn't get a process authority letter for that co-packer, then you cannot sell that product.
Okay.
And if you change co-packers, you'll need a process authority letter specifically for that co-packer.
Got it. Super helpful. I love that. And are there any other costs associated with sort of getting set up with your co-packer that we should be aware of and putting into our budget for making this transition?
Yeah, absolutely. So a few of the other things, one, I would say if you do have a state university or even just a health department that you can contact about any additional costs that you should be aware of, from certifications, certain states will say, oh, you need this permit to produce
Gotcha.
your product with a co-packer, or it's not super common, but California does have a few of those, and they sometimes vary even by county that you're producing in. So just a lot of times your co-packer that you're having conversations with will also be aware of these, but it never hurts to reach out to an outside source to
Yeah.
validate that cost and the
And
need for it.
And sometimes I know there are some businesses who are located in one state and they've got a co-packer in another state, and so they may not be privy to.
Exactly.
Let me ask
Yeah.
this question. Like, let's say, so it's based on the state where the product is being manufactured, not where the home base of the company is. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So then in that case, we say, okay, yeah, the co-packer should be familiar with those things, but it just in case to do your due diligence, looking into that
Yeah,
makes
it's
sense.
just a smart idea. Additional cost beyond that, one is shelf life testing.
Okay.
If you need to have a shelf life test done, it's around $300 per product, depending upon the food lab that you're going to. A lot of times, a co-packer will have a food lab that they have worked with in the past, and they'll refer you to them. It's up to you typically to submit samples and to pay that fee on your own. But they're typically pretty open to sharing recommendations for
Okay.
shelf life testing.
And do you need to send the specific product that has been produced by your co-packer to get that shelf life testing done, right? You can't like use your home
Yes.
recipe and get that
The,
tested.
yeah, you can, but it's not valid,
Got
right?
it.
You're looking to validate the process and the formulation that is your end product. So you want to do the shelf life testing with product from the co-packer.
Great.
And that testing, shelf life is interesting. You can do what's called a standard shelf life, where if you have a year shelf life on a product, you're going to need to let it sit for a year to validate.
Right.
Or you can do accelerated testing, and it's maybe a slightly higher cost, but it's very reasonable typically. And what that does is a 1 for 1. So 1 week equals 1 month in this accelerated shelf life. So if you have a product that has a 3 month shelf life, then it will only take, that would typically be 3 months. So
Yeah.
you would take that down to 3 weeks
Yeah.
in order to validate that.
Fascinating and probably important. You know, I'm sure there are people who are in situations where they need to move. They need to
Yeah.
get things going. And so they're
We're-
like, I don't have a year. I don't have 6 months.
Yes.
Let's accelerate this. So
We're
that's a great tip.
entrepreneurs. We like to move forward, right? Need to move.
Totally. Okay. So we've got our process authority letter. We've got our shelf life testing. Anything else that we should be factoring in?
Yeah, so I would say additional cost after you're producing with a co-packer,
Okay.
things to think about are shipping, because a lot of times a co-packer will not handle shipping. They
Okay.
produce the product and it's your responsibility to pick it up.
Okay.
And so there's a lot of different shipping services out there. A co-packer can typically tell you who their most common pickup companies are, and you can reach out to all of those and get a quote. It's a simple process, usually just a conversation, and they'll email you a price quote. And then, so that varies a lot by product, by company. It typically is based on the number of pallets that you'll be shipping at a time. And so it's hard to give a price estimate for that, but that's an additional cost that you'll need to be thinking about.
Okay.
And then storage fees. Storage, a lot of times you will need to have storage for your finished products. So on rare occasion, a co-packer will offer a storage at their facility, but also with a fee.
Right.
So there's that built in. And then also storage fees for packaging materials. If you have a special packaging, a lot of times if you're in a 16-ounce pint jar, the co-packer has that on hand, and they're not going to charge you an additional storage fee because it's their packaging material that they're sourcing in bulk anyways.
Okay.
But if you have, say, a 7.5 ounce jar that is a squatty little guy and completely different from anything else they source, they may possibly charge you a storage fee to hold this space for your packaging material that can only be used to produce your product.
Okay. Or is that something that you can talk about and get a quote on from the co-packer in the earlier stages to just kind of make sure you fully understand what that and maybe like the storage, if they offer that, might be?
Yes, I recommend for companies to have that conversation as part of their co-packer interview.
Okay.
So before they ever even get to kitchen testing or anything like that, they already have an idea of what are the storage costs that I need to be factoring into my budget as well.
Okay. Awesome. So we're talking about, when we initially reach out to the co-packers and we're just sort of understanding their business and if our volumes match up and if they can produce the type of product that we want to produce. And then we get to the numbers part of things. We can ask these questions, not only the price to produce our product, but then all of the sort of additional things that might start to add up. And then you can factor that all in and say, okay, at the end of the day, once it's produced, once it's stored or shipped or what have you, it still works for us. Then we can move on.
Yes, because I know, if I have a product, I'm going to be super apprehensive about the nickel and dime cost, as we say. Those things that just add up to thousands of dollars, but you didn't factor them in at the beginning. And so it's really important to have a straight conversation with the co-packer when you're asking them questions in your interview of them. These are just simple questions that you ask them, and they usually have a standard fee for all of these things, and so they're very familiar with being able to give a quote on these additional costs.
I love it. So have we covered all of the additional costs, or is there anything else we need to touch on?
No,
we covered it.
I think that's all the additional. Yeah.
And I think a tip might be for the business owner to just think about the process, right? And I'm sure you've got resources on this that we can link to in the show notes, but think about like my product is going to be produced, then my product's going to be put in a case. And are they going to charge me for that case box, or am I providing that case box, right? And like,
right,
what is all of that like? And the shipping, like you mentioned, and any storage fees related. So just try to get very, is it micro or macro? I always forget on like, what is the process, that my little product is going to take, and all the different areas and points that might have a cost associated with them. I always like to just get overly analytical, of course, right? And like put it all down there and be really clear on what we might run into or what we definitely will run into as far as the cost goes.
Yeah, I definitely recommend for companies to think through the process backwards. So if you start at distribution, what are the steps I'm taking before distribution? What is that step immediately before distribution? And really break it down into step by step and identify potential cost associated with each of those steps. If you know that you're hiring a delivery truck to go pick up for you, that's a cost. And so you can begin to see pretty clearly, but I recommend that step-by-step thought process because it really helps you get clear, for one, and have some clarity around what is this process going to feel like, what's it going to look like, but then it also gives you the preparation for the financial mentality of it, right? Like the emotions tied to that. And so just really important to be thoughtful through the whole process.
Yeah. I love that. Think through it backwards. That's so great. It's like when you've written an email, and you've read it like 3 times and you aren't catching like that the word if is or the or something is like missing, right? So if you're going through it the way that you kind of know that it happens or kind of from start to finish, you can miss that step. But if you're really thoughtful, like you're saying, and you go backwards, it's easier to make sure you're hitting all of those steps. And I think that's an awesome tip. That might be my favorite tip so far of the
reverse engineer always
I love it.
Is helpful.
Amazing. So we've got our formula. We have done our production run, we've got our, shelf life testing done, and we've made sure that we can actually sell our product. It's not going to hurt anybody. We're ready to start like for real producing, like our first big run. Are there additional costs associated with this? What should we be aware of at this stage where we're kind of like officially getting going?
Well, this is the stage where cash flow becomes really important.
Okay.
So if you'll need an understanding of how many units is a minimum run for a co-packer. And so this gives you an idea of what is that upfront cost for my first initial product run. It doesn't seem so daunting when you think about my product is $3 when you see the price quote per unit. But if they require 5 pallets and there's 300 jars on that pallet, that adds up to 1,500 units times $3. It becomes a much bigger fee. So typically what I recommend for companies to budget for their first production run is anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000. And typically the cost with this is that a lot of times 50% of the cost is due up front and then 50% is due at pickup. Or they may say it's a net 14 for your costs. So it's really helpful to think through what is the minimum volume? Is that what I'm running? Typically it is. A lot of times a company is not looking to run over a minimum production run for their first one. And so if you have that 1 pallet minimum for a product and you know that you have 1,000 jars on that pallet or 1,000 cans, and it's $1 per can, then you have $1,000 there. But typically $5,000 is a really good starting budget for that initial product run.
Okay. And I would assume that you're wanting to think through how long is this first production run going to last me, right? And exactly. So then, like you mentioned, cash flow becomes important because now you've got potentially a 50% layout of cash, right, to get this going. The remaining 50% or net 14, to get it shipped. And then maybe it lasts you 6 months. And so you need to know when your next $5,000 cash outlay, for example, is going to be.
Exactly. Yeah, you're exactly right. And so just building a budget around this will really help, one, with confidence, right? To be able to go into these conversations feeling confident and competent and able to make decisions for your business without having that freak out moment at the last minute right before a production run. That's pretty common. And if we can mitigate that by being mentally prepared for the financial side of it, it really portrays a more trusting relationship with the co-packer too, and allows us to build a partnership together for the long term, and instead of having a lot of anxiety for yourself, we're just trying to prepare as much as possible for the financial side.
Love it. Anything else? I feel like, once that first run is done and I feel like there's probably a big sigh of relief that happens, right? There's probably the cash flow stress maybe. I'll try to help you prevent that. But then a big sigh of relief because it's happening. And you can kind of keep it going. Anything we need to know in general or specifically like cost wise as we continue our relationship with the co-packer? Or is it pretty much like now we've got a working relationship and we order product and
it's a pretty straightforward relationship after that. There can be a lot of time associated with managing that relationship sometimes, but from a cost perspective, it's pretty straightforward at that point. And if for some reason they're ever going to have an increase in price, that should be in your contract that they have to give you 30 to 60 days notice that they're going to have a price increase. And so you're trying to mitigate those surprise costs for production for yourself, but also realizing that there are price increases sometimes. Ingredient costs go up, packaging costs go up, as we saw in 2020 when nothing was available. And so it happens, but you want to try to build in some buffers into your contracts so you have some time to prepare for that financially.
Yeah. And in our scenario with our dressing example, we made our formula and we had a great test run, and we moved forward with the co-packer that we chose initially. And I'm sure that in the real world, it's not always a smooth and perfect ride. I would love to hear from you if we go through that feasibility testing or those early stages and we decide this isn't a good fit, whether it's from the co-packer's end or from our end. What does that mean for us, kind of logistically and of course, financially, as a business owner?
So logistically, it means that you're starting over to find a co-packer. So it's very time consuming. As much as we can, we want to try to be so well prepared on the front end and really have that feeling of, is this the right co-packer? Because if it's not, you're beginning this process all over. And so we want to try to mitigate that as much as possible. Also keep in mind that any R&D cost for the development phase for that production testing will be retained by the co-packer. Because again, even if it's not acceptable product, they still use the ingredients and the packaging necessary to produce it.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, that's just a cost we have to eat, and it's not a fun feeling, but it is what it is. And so that is something to keep in mind. And then any special ingredients that the co-packer ordered for you, they would still bill you for that, and it's your responsibility to pay for it, but they should also release that product to you. So if you do go to another co-packer, you can then deliver it to that co-packer, the next co-packer, and be able to let them begin without having another ingredient cost for that. And then again, it is your responsibility for the finished product. So whether that's selling through that product at a reduced cost or taking a loss by donating it to a food bank, whatever that looks like, keep in mind that there will be a cost associated with that.
Yeah.
So all that to say that doing the due diligence and taking the time on the front end of this process can really save you $10,000. I know it seems like very painful for a lot of companies when you say, for me, I recommend that companies have a 6-month window before going to a co-packer, because that's really the time it's going to take for you to prepare your formulation, your specification, to walk through this process with a co-packer of interviewing, to do your kitchen testing, to have production testing, and to do it in a healthy manner.
Yeah.
And that's often painful for companies to hear. 6 months seems absolutely absurd and painful. We don't have 6 months whenever we're working ourselves to the bone.
Yeah.
But do you have $10,000 extra to spare at the end if it all goes wrong? And I've seen companies go through this process with 3 or 4 different co-packers. And so a year and a half down the road, you still aren't any further along, and you've now spent $50,000. And so it can really add up. So it's worth it to take the time on the front end and really not just understand the cost of it, but to be prepared for the conversations with that co-packer, and to be very decisive about that relationship and make sure it is the right partnership that you want to be in.
Yeah. I so appreciate you laying out the costs for us, because I think things become very clear when you put a dollar amount to it, right? Like people who are listening, like, oh, okay, maybe this isn't so bad, right? $500 for this, maybe up to $3,000 for this. Like I've got the budget for that. This is feeling good. But there's that caveat, like if you haven't done the due diligence up front, if this isn't the right partner, it's your cost times 2 at least, right? If you're going to go through this process again. And I think that's that's an important part of the process. And we want people to both understand what they're getting into, right, in terms of a financial commitment and how to appropriately budget for this so you're set up for success financially, but also to ask the right questions and make sure that you're embarking on this journey with a partner that you're really confident will be the right one for you. And I know that you also help with that process and what those conversations should look like. So can you share with our listeners a little bit more about the services that you provide to help with getting this right?
Yeah, we really, our purpose as a company is to empower food entrepreneurs and to help them navigate the journey of co-packing with as little headache as possible and to feel confident in the process. And so we offer a one-on-one coaching program, and the first phase of that program is actually an 8-week coaching program where we walk companies through our membership website, where we have learning tutorials on this exact process. How do we set our long-term goals and be able to develop the clarity around, is a co-packer right for me? Is this the right time for a co-packer? If it's not, when is the right time? Mm-hmm. And then the next phase of that is to begin, no matter your size, no matter your stage, to begin preparing your formulation and product spec. So we have templates for that. We walk companies through that one-on-one for how to do that. And then helping you develop custom tailored questions for your co-packer interviews, really breaking down the process of how you're going to approach conversations with a co-packer. And we do that from what's that first phone call? What is the conversation you're having with them, through to you're meeting in person now. What does that feel like? Like, how do you need to mentally, emotionally, physically prepare for that? And then into the financial side in those conversations as well. And then we help companies work through the financial side as a whole, because we really feel like if a company is not paying themselves, then as the owner, then you're not running a successful business. And so we help companies work through that process of laying that foundation for themselves. And we do it through the lens of preparing for a co-packer, but also keeping in mind just your general business costs too, and operating costs. And so that program is really meant to be, we have one-on-one calls every other week with clients, and then we have an online forum and weekly Q&A calls as well as a group. So there's a group aspect to the individual side of the coaching program as well.
I think it's such an amazing resource. I know a couple of the members of our online program are working through that coaching program with you and are loving it and just finding so much value and support and, like you said, clarity in the process. Because if you've never had a conversation with a co-packer before, you don't quite know how to approach it, right? How do you have a successful initial phone call with that person? I know that sometimes people feel like, I've reached out to a co-packer and they aren't getting back to me, right? So like even just overcoming like those types of things initially in the initial outreach, it can be so helpful to have an expert guiding you, and then also the support of you and members of the community. So I'm so glad that you offer that service and to be connected with you and to have you as a resource as well. Because I think, as I said earlier, this information is so helpful, and it serves business owners so well to know this information up front rather than to learn it as you go and, finding yourself in need of a co-packer, wanting to move it forward as quickly as possible and suddenly having to pay for things that weren't on your radar. So
yeah, and we're really trying to create efficiency for companies, right? Like, you can do a ton of research and still never find, you can't really just Google how to have a co-packer conversation or how to write my processing procedures, or those are areas that we don't have just readily available information for online. And so we try to mitigate all of that tedious searching that you're trying to do and create some efficiency for companies in preparing for their co-packer conversations and that relationship going forward.
That's awesome. Well, for those business owners listening, and I'm sure there are many of them who want to learn more about your coaching program and just learn more about you and your business, where can they go to do that?
Yeah, so our website is metzgerandroth.com, and Metzger is Metzger, and the word and, Roth, Roth. And that is, Metzger and Roth is a German word for butcher and a Scottish name for redhead. So there is some logic behind it.
Love
it's the
that.
redheaded butcher. But that is where you'll find us. And we have information on our website. And I would love to have a strategy call for free with anyone that's listening to the podcast.
Awesome. So what we can do is we'll definitely link to your website within the show notes. And so that everyone, who didn't get to write down the proper spelling, don't worry about it. It's in the show notes for you. And then we can do a special link. So it will perhaps identify them as, someone who was listening, who's reaching out, or, we can kind of include any instructions there in the show notes. Well, Ashley, it has been an absolute pleasure. As with so many of our guests, I feel like I could talk to you for hours and hours, but we have to stop somewhere, right? So thank you so much for joining me here today, and I'm sure we'll hear from you again, either on this podcast or perhaps in our online community, where I'm sure folks have some questions for you as well. So thank you so
Absolutely.
much.
No, thank you, Sarah. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.
I am so happy to let you know that Ashley is joining me in the free Profitable Food Business community to continue this conversation. If you're not yet a member, join the group for the date and details by visiting profitablefoodbusinesscommunity.mn.co or by tagging me, Sarah Delavan Consulting, on Instagram to let us know you're listening, and I'll send you the link to join in your DMs. Thank you so much for joining me here today. Have a good one.